Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another meeting of the Research Triangle PowerShell User Group. My name is Mike Kanakis, and tonight it is my pleasure to introduce to you guys Dan Hills, who's going to be talking about using automation to elevate your code creation. So how's it going, Dan? What's new?
Yeah, doing well. This is a topic that I covered at PowerShell Summit. Kind of condensed it down a little bit. It was already kind of a pretty short talk, so we won't go too long tonight. I know it's already kind of running a little bit late, so hopefully that'll get you guys out of there not too late tonight. But I think this is a pretty important topic for me, and I like to try and make my uh, my code easier to write. And that's what I'm really trying to focus on tonight, is really giving you a good ideas that are kind of somewhat somewhat good for newer people. These are things like Plaster and tasks, and we'll get into that as we get into it. But
So Dan, let me ask you. So there's going to be a fair amount of people that find this video on YouTube and don't know too much about PowerShell or nothing about our group and our community. So for the people watching at home, I don't know if you have a slide about this, but maybe you could just tell them a little bit about who you are and your background and what your sort of daily workflow or responsibilities are.
sure, yeah. So I don't have a slide for it, but I am a system engineer. I've worked across multiple industries in New York City for the better part of about 18, close to 20 years now, across financial, insurance, public relations, media and entertainment, where we worked on the world's largest cowboy simulator. I really didn't want to ever be a coder or programmer. Didn't I studied computer science initially, didn't really blend well with it, didn't work with my mind very well at the time that I was studying it. But when I came to understand PowerShell by just using things like the exchange management tools, it kind of did something to my brain where it just kind of fit. Came to understand how that object orientation works, and it really changed my career and how I was able to then progress through my career by taking things that I learned from PowerShell, using it to um, write better code in other languages like Python, or how I actually worked with code in things like Ansible. So some of the things that I'm going to talk about tonight are just how I approach code across the spectrum, and just use VS Code really as a tool to to make my code a little bit more seamless.
Awesome. And so if I could just reinforce that message a little bit, um, a lot of the people that demo at our group are infrastructure focused. And I think the majority of people that are in the infrastructure space did not get started with a formal computer background. I know, like myself, I fell into the infrastructure space after doing other things in college. And so the point that Dan makes is one that definitely resonates with me. It's like when I first started trying to do PowerShell and automation, it did not seem easy at all. Not that PowerShell was a hard language to learn, but I had no formal education in the concepts of automation and scripting and basic concepts like loops and things like that. I had to learn that on my own. But as Dan said, sticking with it and doing a little bit each day, really, it became much easier over time. And then the concepts became very easy to grasp and grow with. So definitely want to reinforce that point. That's how most of us probably got our start doing automation.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you really need to invest the time, and really getting hands-on with it absolutely helps a ton. But you're going to fail a lot. I think that's the thing to really understand, is that this is not a process that you're going to say, I need to read this one book and just understand it. It is a process that you need to write continuously, fail a lot, and then come back and learn from those mistakes, figure out what you can do to make your process more efficient and faster, and then over time it gets a lot easier.
Yeah. And one last point before we turn it over to Dan. Jeff Hicks, many people know, he's the co-author of the Month of Lunches books. He's presented for our group a number of times. He made a comment in one of our meetings. He said PowerShell is no different than any other language, not even outside of computer languages. You wouldn't expect to learn Spanish or French doing it once every 6 weeks. And so the same holds true with PowerShell. If you want to learn the language, you need to find excuses to do it probably daily.
Immersion.
Yeah, you need to immerse yourself in it and just be okay with not being comfortable with all the concepts, and it'll come over time. So I'm sorry to digress, Dan. Just wanted to reinforce those points. So take it away.
Awesome. Yeah, no, definitely appreciate it. Cool. So yeah, already kind of talked about it, but longtime engineer, and over the last kind of 6 to 5 years, kind of really looked at how to make my code writing process as efficient as possible. I'm going to kind of share some of that over the next 40 minutes or so with you guys. As you can tell, and I didn't mention this, but as you can tell from my headshot here, I am a dog lover. I have Shibas. They're somewhere around here, but at the very least, you'll see the picture in the background. There will be some other references to Shiba throughout. See if you can spot them. They'll be there kind of hidden. Cool. So this talk in general is going to be about how to build and use low-code kind of tools within VS Code, trying to make your code writing process a lot more efficient. And if you're not using VS Code right now, I absolutely recommend it. The capability and customizability there, it is like you can't really match it with other products that, especially when you're coming to writing just PowerShell code. You absolutely need to look at what VS Code can offer, really finding the tools that make sense for your workflows, and designing the processes that you can use to write your code. But for tonight, we're going to really just focus in on how to create Plaster modules or modules using Plaster. Plaster is a tool that was developed a long time ago. It's had some updates in the past, but it's kind of still my core tool for how I produce new modules, even though it hasn't really seen a ton of new updates over time. The nice thing is you can also extend it to kind of do whatever you want it to do. We'll also talk about using VS Code Snippets. Snippets are not really necessarily just looking at things that you might see on a wiki to say, take this code. What you can do is a lot more robust and more efficient ways of being able to develop your code in line. And as you're trying to get new people on board, they have new ways to templatize their scripts and make them more efficient and ease that burden for onboarding to your team as well. If we get some time, we'll talk about tasks and key maps. These are pretty, just really kind of just more tools for VS Code to make your life a lot easier. We'll also just look at ways to make your coding practice consistent across the board. I think the one thing to keep in mind is that you want to create an environment not just for yourself, but for other people on your team, and allow your team to write, code that's recognizable to anybody that's trying to pick it up. Because ideally, you're not going to be the only one modifying the code over time. You should be really trying to build a standard and a standard practice for not just yourself, but for anybody working on a project that you're also a part of. And really, the ultimate goal here, of course, is to try and build speed, efficiency across your team. Just really make it easier for anybody to write code. So what is Plaster? Plaster is just a way to scaffold and create projects and modules for your code development cycle. It's kind of the first pillar of what you should be looking at when you're creating code. And we're not going to really dive too much into what you would do to package that module. I think that is in itself its own large conversation to have. But we're really just looking at that first step in the process and really making sure you're getting the most efficient way to write your code. And I think Plaster is one of the most important skills to learn in PowerShell development to make your life a lot easier when you're developing modules. So yeah, as I mentioned, it's customizable to an extent. Like I said, it hasn't been updated in a long time, and I think that's the biggest attractor to it. If you really take what you build from a Plaster module, or you look at external tools like Stucco, there are opportunities to build additional efficiencies in there. I think the module as it is right now is a bit rigid, so it's hard to make it do exactly what you want to do, but you can definitely use your skills in automation to really elevate that process and build it to what you want it to look like. And I think the one maybe detractor here is it is XML based. You can think of it as what you want. I think it makes the code the process of creating templates fairly easy. Once you understand what you're looking for, once you understand the parameters that you're going to be using inside of a Plaster template, it's not terribly challenging. It's just you need to kind of understand where the XML functions and how to actually use it inside of your templates.
Hey, Dan, got a question for you.
Yeah.
So a little bit out of left field, sorry, but maybe talk about why modules? Why, what's the purpose of modules? What does it get you at work?
Yeah. I mean, modules are really all about condensing your code and organizing your code in a way that you can pass it over to anybody on your team to take a set of functions, an organized group of functions, and actually build a process inside of those functions so that anybody can take it and trust that the code that you've written internally can work for them. Really, you're trying to build tools that other people can use yourself as well. You just want to have a recognizable way to write something and really build a task rather than just a script to do one thing. You want to allow customization. You want to allow parameters. You want people to answer the questions that they need their script, their function to do. It's really about trying to organize all that code in a sensible way and allow you to actually execute the code against the environment.
Yeah, makes your code consumable for others without them having to know file paths. It makes it reusable. You write your code in a way so that it works in a variety of different situations. And so, if you've ever gone and downloaded a module from Microsoft or from VMware or Azure, you're essentially doing the same thing. You're building the piece of code that makes your module shareable with others. So you write code, and then you want to circulate it within your organization. The last thing you want to do is get a call every time someone needs a script, and you have to tell them to go to this file path, or how come it didn't work? Let me come and look at your machine. A module solves all of that. It makes it portable, makes it installable on their machine, and it makes it local to their environment.
And then the nice thing is there are so many options to extend that process, to extend where you're deploying it. If you get into a state where you are using repositories that are trusted internal repositories, you can ask your internal development teams, anybody really, to just pull down from that internal repository, and you can trust that that source is internally, usable by anybody. It allows you to really have a place that anybody can go to, centralized, and work with code that you've developed internally. And as you get into the process of developing real full code pipelines, that whole life cycle of code from code creation into the testing framework that you're building, hopefully, and into the deployment process, that's all going to be using modules behind the scenes to really condense and organize the code so that it's easy and digestible by anybody. Cool. Were there any other questions, or haven't been checking
I think
chat?
we're good.
All right, awesome. Cool. So to see what Plaster is kind of looking at, I have this kind of short demo here. So the first thing you want to do if you're starting new with Plaster is go into the PS gallery. You can use this find PS resource command. This will be the module that you're looking for. And like I said, it hasn't been updated since 2022. That's not to say that this isn't a great module still. It still works and functions exactly as you're expecting it to do. And it's still very fully functional. You can absolutely use it without having to worry about, things like Stucco right now, I know are kind of not functioning. So I still go back to Plaster as my core part of writing my modules and creating my modules. And if you're new to PowerShell, the way you can pull down, and like I said, this is just going from any internal repository, or right now we're actually going out to the PS Gallery. You're going to install PS resource on Plaster, and that will just pull down the module right to your computer. From there, you're going to be able to then actually execute any commands that are inside of that module. And I didn't include that in the demo, but you can do a get command dash module and the Plaster name. That'll give you every list of commands in there. There's not very many for Plaster, but this is a good place to at least get started with it. The thing that is nice about Plaster is it does come with these kind of built-in templates. So if you run this get Plaster template command, this will actually give you a list of available templates. And the one that will get you at least somewhat functional is this second one, this new PowerShell script module. This is a pretty bare bones module creation kit, kind of, and that's really what you're trying to do here, is just get started with running through the process of creating new modules. So we're going to do here.
I'm sorry, Dan, I just want to say, in case it's not obvious, if you're not familiar with these concepts, so you don't need Plaster to build a module. This is a process that you can do by hand, and you can make your own modules. Plaster makes it easier. So it's essentially, imagine if you were building a house. This is the thing that's going to build the scaffolding that allows you to build the house, right? So it's going to create all the walls and the guideline and the guardrails for where you should put stuff. And then you create your scripts and you put them into the areas that Plaster is instantiated for you. And so what Plaster does is it just eliminates a lot of the tedious work that you would do if you wrote a lot of modules yourself. You don't need it, but it just makes things faster and easier.
Exactly. Yeah. Cool. So from here, I'm just going to create a new Plaster project. I'm just creating a random folder here. I'm throwing this into my local app data folder. This is really just strictly for the demo's sake. Obviously, within your own organization, you're going to want to organize this a little bit better, but this is all dependent upon where you want to create your project. And the main way to actually execute anything in Plaster is using this invoke Plaster command. This template path is a reference to this variable that we grabbed earlier, and really it's just referencing actually this specific template. So we're taking that template path here that's identified here, and we're actually going to execute that template and throw it into this new folder that we created inside of app data. And the nice thing about Plaster is it is going to walk you through the whole process. You can hand this over to somebody and they'll have a fully guided process of how to create that module that you're trying to create. You can be any particular topic that you want. I'd like to try and say you should really organize it around either a product or a service that you're trying to reference or identify, and try and use that as a way to key in on specific sets of functions that you want to develop for your module. And this is really up to you as a developer, whatever you want to include in here. I'm just going to include some very basic stuff here. This is just going to be a test module. And again, there are things in here that you can build towards your internal development teams. This is however you want to version stuff. I'm just going to use the defaults for a lot of this and kind of step through really quickly. And as you can tell, it kind of did a whole lot there. All this is really doing is now creating files and folders inside of that directory. These are all just showing me exactly what it did behind the scenes. And this is just a very basic setup of what I would want from a module. If I look at that.
Dan?
Yes.
Are there some documented guidelines for naming a module? I know there's certainly guidelines for naming functions, but for the collection of functions that go into a module, what might you derive from what's in the module to say guide you to name the module?
That's a great question, but because I don't know that there is any specific reference to really go back to. I like to key in on kind of following practices that Microsoft does, where you include the name of your organization, really to identify that it's whether it's an internal project that's being created by somebody on your team, or if it's something coming from an external party. Then I like to also include, like I said, the service that it's actually targeting. So if it's going to be something against Microsoft Graph, I would call it my company name and then Microsoft Graph, and then whatever else it might actually be functioning. If you want to break it down even further, you can include an additional point in there. That's kind of how I typically think about it. I don't know that there's any other really scientific document on how you should be doing this. I think it's all kind of depends on the design practice that you want to instill inside of your own team. But that's typically what I try and do, is at least include the organization that it's coming from and the name or of the service that it's actually targeting or managing.
So I would say that people that are doing it for business, it's pretty straightforward. Like Dan said, people that are making modules public, names get a little creative and sometimes get a little kooky and fun. So there is no rhyme or reason.
Yep, and it's not really policed at all, so you can kind of do whatever you want in some cases too. So to break down kind of what we just created when we created that Plaster module, it's creating this PSD1, PSM1. Those are in the PowerShell world, those are the minimum requirements for your module. You absolutely need technically you only really need the PSM1, because you can include everything in the PSM1 file. The PSD1 includes metadata that really should be included if you're going to pass this on to anybody else. So those would, while not necessarily the minimum requirement to have both of them, I think you should always have at least those two when you're creating a new module anywhere. Now, Plaster has already created those for me, and the nice thing about this is it also adds some of the stuff that I entered into that template. So we're going to jump into VS Code and take a look at what it actually created for me. So I called that module test. So it actually also created this folder called test and made a reference to that inside of my module itself, named the module file itself test. And then in the PSM1, this is very, very basic template, but this is where you kind of get started with the very bare minimum for what you need to do for your module. Now, if I had included things like a description in here, it would have also entered it into the description field. These are all things that are very customizable, and we'll drill into that a bit more as we continue on. All right, so like I said, this is the bare minimum that you need to do when you're creating a module, and in most cases is really include that PSD1, that's your manifest, your information for the module itself, maybe references to the specific functions that you're going to include in there, a description of the module, any of the author information should be included in that PSD1 file. The PSM1 file, that's going to be where all of your functions are going to be stored. I also like to include at least a README file so that anybody that's coming to your GitHub project or wherever source control is, they have a way to learn about the most important key parts of your function, or or your module, or the key things, key functions that they want to highlight for your module. Having a README is a great way to include that in here. Obviously, you should have things like comment-based help inside of your module, inside of your functions, but a README is also a good starting point for anybody that needs to learn how to use your module. So I like to think, this is a good place to start, and there's nothing wrong with just having these two files. Really, you need to think about things like scalability and reusability, customizability. This is very simplified, and you can't do a ton with just these two files, because what happens when this PSM1 file continues to grow over time? What happens as you have multiple people trying to commit changes to this single file? You have 5 people trying to make changes. You're all going to have conflicts as you're trying to commit code to that module. So what I really like to do and recommend to people to do is to try and break this down a bit further, and we'll look at something called dot sourcing for this module. But before we get into that, I want to really just highlight that this is not anything that you need to necessarily do. You can still live in this world. You can still use 2 files to do everything that you need. It's just that when you're thinking about how this will grow, that should be at the forefront of why you're creating this module, is how do I allow other people to contribute to it? How do I make it so that when people are contributing to it, they know what to look for and what did they do to write code that's similar to what you're doing? So that's what the real core concept of this talk is just how do I get other people onboarded to make their lives easier? How do I make it consistent for what they're trying to accomplish? How do I get things like CI/CD in place inside of their module? That all can be included as a part of your Plaster template that you're trying to create. And before we go on, I do want to just talk about dot sourcing a bit, because I think that's a concept that's probably going to be new to a lot of people. So dot sourcing, it can be kind of complicated to understand. Really what it ultimately comes down to is when you are looking at a PowerShell script and you're running a PowerShell script. So if I have this hello world script and just has this one function inside of that script and it's declaring that function, you would think that if I were to execute that script, it would run that hello world command. But the truth is that inside of that scope, all it's doing is taking the script and condensing it inside of the script scope, running the code inside of the script scope, and only executing inside of the script. So once that script ends, it no longer has a concept of what it declared inside of that script scope. So that function that was declared is lost. You're kind of now just looking at this kind of blank canvas again, and you're really has no idea that it was ever declared in the past. So if I were to run hello world now, it doesn't even know that I ever had any information about that hello world script before, or function before. Now, what dot sourcing is really just about placing a period in front of the execution of the script, and that will run it inside of the current scope that you're running your shell in. So it's kind of running it inside of this universal shell global scope that rather than piecing it into a script scope and running inside of a script scope, it's now running at this higher level and actually understands that that function should be declared across the entire host. Now, when I run this write hello world, it actually understands and can execute that function. So that's kind of the core concepts of what dot sourcing is.
There we go. You could continue. Fine.
Cool. So ways to incorporate this into your module design, though, is about trying to take the concept of function declarations and including them inside of single individual files. So you're actually taking each function declaration, and now they're a script unto themselves, really. And you're just going to simplify the process of actually creating new functions internally, because now that whole process is really going to be consistent. You're going to make the naming convention follow along with the function that they're creating. Every function should just have, that write hello world script that I had. That's going to be the function declaration for write hello world. So it just makes it a lot easier for everybody to understand what's going on with your inside of your module. Then what you can do is you take the functions, organize them in a way that your public and private functions, and private in this case would be just something that's local to the module scope that it's running in, and whereas public functions are going to be something that anybody can use and anybody can access once they've loaded the module. They'll have the ability to execute that code, whereas a private function is really more of a helper function for the module to process information. And what we'll try and do here is, when you take a lot of the burden away from that PSM1 file, it simplifies it. You can now templatize that whole PSM1 file. All it's really doing now is going to be just dot sourcing. So it's going to read all the functions inside of your PSM or inside of your module and dot source each one of them. That brings it into a scope that it understands, and then once you export those module members out to your global scope, now you can run it anywhere else. It also helps simplify your PSD one, because really a lot of it is going to be just inside of you're going to build that through your template process. And as you get further into your code pipeline, things like declaring your actual functions, that can all be stuff that you're pulling from your public folders and just looking at all the public folder files and then making a reference to those inside of your actual code pipeline. It shouldn't be something that you're necessarily modifying on a daily basis. What you're going to do from taking this two-file organization is you're really looking at developing and separating it out, writing and creating these multiple files that each are declaring the function that they're trying to execute. And these PSD1, PSM1 files are really simplifying. A lot of this other stuff, it's all up to how you want to have your opinionated organization about what you want inside of your module. Maybe you don't necessarily need classes. I've included it here just as an example of what you can do, though. These are all things that you can really figure out as you're building your processes internally, as you're figuring out how to develop code internally.
So a good talking point. Could you go back to that slide for 1 second, Dan?
Yep.
So just so you guys understand, so Plaster, he mentioned Stucco earlier. That's another module. There's other modules out there to build your modules for you. The reason many of these things exist is because for some people, they don't know how to do what you see on the screen. And I don't mean physically don't know how to do it, but it takes away the idea of you having to figure out how to organize your stuff. It presents an organization structure for you, and then you simply place the files in the areas that you want. And so that's what some of these modules are there to do. They build the module for you. They also build the structure so you know, oh, I see there's a docs folder. I guess I should put my docs in the docs folder. None of this is required other than the PSM and the PSD file, which Dan was talking about earlier. And as Dan said, there's a great debate in the community about how you should organize your modules. That is why these modules exist, because they're there to help you make decisions for people who are lost and say, I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do. So when we said earlier that Plaster is there to make this easier, you could do this entire process by hand, by yourself, with the built-in commandlets that are in PowerShell. You don't need Plaster, you don't need Stucco, you don't need any of the other build modules. The process is there to make all of this faster, because chances are most people want to write their code, they want to make their functions, and they want to give it to people. They don't want to spend all day making the module. So that's the whole point of all this, is to make all of this easier for you, so you don't have to sit there and think about, how should I organize? Where should this go? That's the entire purpose of those modules.
Really about onboarding new people to your project, making things consistent, and like you said, make it really easy to understand. Things like the README will help you learn about the module, but if you're consistent across all of your projects, you're not even going to need that over time as you get more comfortable with it, because everybody in your team will say, oh, this is a Plaster built module. I know where to look for this specific function. I know where to go to contribute to this function. And it makes your life a lot easier. And of course, it's a lot faster, because this whole scaffolding process is just down to one template. Once you really build that template over time, you're almost never going to need to really go back and modify it. You can really build that process early on and just kind of trust that it's going to create the modules that you in a way that you want everybody to contribute to it.
Dan, we have a question in the room.
So the example then, this is Atif. The example that you started with is good to like a start to learn Plaster when there was only a test file and there are two, the data and the other file. But what I'm saying is that most of the cases, what I'm seeing on the screen is more like some software when you install, which is built on maybe the similar, like the style. If you install something like QuickBooks, TurboTax, or some structured software, they have a library structure like this, installation folders. So what I'm asking is that if somebody is going to that like a modulated Plaster using a software, a big architectural software for a company too, like Align, what are the commands I can use to ask it to actually create the whole some kind of folder structures, like a complicated one, including something like this?
Yeah.
Is there a command where you could say, okay, create me all, create me the log file, create me the docs and classes and this and that, like create a really structured set, not like a basic, and then I can start going and modifying.
Yes and no. Stucco is the kind of answer to what you're asking for, because it can build all of this really for you. The problem is Stucco as it is right now is actually got some breaking changes within the last year, which seem to not allow you to do some of the functionality that Stucco had built in. It would do all of this, the dot sourcing was, and building a lot of the folder structure, including things like the build commands and Jenkins files or GitHub Actions files. That was all included in Stucco, and I think I know I talked to Josh Hendricks about this at Summit about there possibly him putting in commits to try and change it. I think the maintainer of the original Stucco project has kind of distanced themselves from the project, so it's hard to get changes made to that original project. And I think there's a community of people that are really looking at developing new ways around this. What I do want to say, though, is you don't necessarily need to have something like Stucco, because you can do all this within Plaster too. And we'll dive into a couple of the options that you have available to you in the next section, because we'll go into kind of the idea of formatting the XML a bit more and using XML a bit more to make it so that you can do this. If you want an easy go-to, though, I think Stucco would have been the answer, but I don't know that I can recommend it right now, unfortunately.
So just to expand on that a little farther. So you don't need any of this. Think of it like how much work you want to do. If you don't use anything, you have to build it all, okay? Dan is advocating for Plaster for two reasons. A, it's been around forever. B, it works. And I guess you could say it's somewhat of a standard. Another tool came along called Stucco, which takes and builds upon Plaster and adds in a lot of other things for guys that are writing on modules that are working in bigger software shops. It'll create GitHub Actions, it'll create tests, it can write your documentation for you, it could even publish a website so that you can host that for people to go read your documentation online. Unfortunately, the project, as Dan was saying, it's not being maintained right now, and there's some talk in the community of people fixing that. But if we talk about doing it all yourself, you have to do everything. Plaster is the middle of the road where you saw he had a template and it made the most basic structure. Stucco takes that to the extreme and it builds out almost a complete structure for you. However, if you back up and you think about what Dan was saying earlier, he showed two templates in the beginning, right? You could make your own template and add it to Plaster so that the next time you build a module, it will build this structure. What he showed you is just the starting point to have a public folder and the two files, and that's it, because that's the bare minimum. But Dan showed you in the beginning there was two templates. You could write your own template for Plaster and then use that going forward, and you could have your own structure that you built in there. So the point is, Plaster gets you started, but if you want to customize it like you were saying, and you want it to look a certain way, you can certainly do that. make your own template, and then the next time you make a module, you call that template, and it'll follow your commands and build it the way you want. So
I have to make one.
well, that's because the one that most of us were using, Stucco, is not in a functional state right now. You can make it work, but you got to jump through a few hoops because there's a few breaking changes. And I know there is a fork of that, and someone is making, I think it was Josh, as Dan said, is making a Stucco module that works. But I will also say that Dan also said, what you're seeing on here, Dan, is this a module that you guys use at work?
This is actually something that I created, and it's on my GitHub. So I was going to dive into a little bit of what looks like behind the scenes. So what you see on the screen is I'll show you this template exactly as it is, and it's also on my GitHub, so you can reference it if you wanted to build this out as it is.
So what I was going to say is that this is the same thing. What you're asking is like what one of my coworkers does at work, and he was trying to solve a problem. He's writing the script as he's trying to solve the problem, and he's getting himself confused. And I was like, you don't need to solve the problem with a script in step one, right? You don't need to start your module with 15 folders. The reason those folders exist is because most people start with a simple module and they build more tools over time and they add them in. And so I think what Dan's trying to say here is that if you know you're going to build a module to that level of detail, it's great to have that structure to start. But if you don't have that, you can start with the basics, and as your module grows, you build the structure as you do it. Like, for example, maybe you don't have in the very beginning docs, which we should all have, but how many people have wrote a function? You start using it, right? Now you want to package it, and you come back and you write the docs later. Maybe you have classes, right? You start using it a lot. You want to build some classes for the organize the data you have in there. I am sure the example that Dan is showing here, he didn't have all these ideas set on day one. He probably grew into this as his modules used more. And now he might say, I know the work that goes into the module. I should probably take the time to do these things, but he doesn't necessarily have to start there. So I would just say, get started with Plaster and figure out the things that you want. Because the other thing is, if you build this whole structure and you don't use it, what purpose did it serve, right? I mean, it's there for the future, I get it. But if you just want to, like, if we go back to the beginning, the essence of this talk was you want to share some code with your coworkers. All you need to do is make some functions, throw them in a PSM1 file, publish a module, and you're done. Of course, that's not everything you should do, but that's all you need to share some code. And to do that,
this structure is really about building for scale, and really about getting to a point where now I'm at 1,000 lines with, 15 different functions. It's hard to, like hunt and peck inside of your module file for the specific ones that you need to modify. And that's what this solves. It makes it a lot easier to find where you need to make the change that you want to make, or if you're trying to contribute to that module, you have an easy way and an easy and consistent way to really build on that module.
I would almost advocate, I did a talk about this like 3 years ago. I would almost advocate that when you start, you build the module by hand using the actual commandlets to generate the PSM and the PSD1, just so you know what's happening. Then when you've done that a few times and that becomes sort of tedious, then you move to the Plasters of the world that automate much of that for you. But if you go straight to Stucco and you have the entire structure built and it all works and everything, when something goes wrong, you kind of don't know the mechanism and how to troubleshoot it. So I wouldn't worry too much about starting here. This is pretty like intense. But it's cool though, very cool. But like Dan says, it's for a specific use case. It's for an org that's got a lot of code that they're looking to share.
And hopefully we're all trying to get to that point. But yes, like Mike said, it's not where you should be starting. Like I said, the 2 files, that's all you really need. Maybe a README file to really drive home how to use the module, how to use the functions. But as you're developing code, as you're learning the processes, as you build your opinions for what your module looks like, that's where you can really enhance it by using something like Plaster. It's all an enhancement, though. You're going to just want to use it initially to just build the basic structure and figure out what makes the most sense for your team.
Mr. Judd wants to know why you have a demo folder in your module.
So yeah, I like to use it actually for when I run the kind of these like basic demo scripts. You can kind of execute specific commands. I like to include a start demo script within my modules just to show how it can work and give a response back to the end user. They can actually see it functioning in real time from their own computer. I really like the start demo because it is a live bit of code rather than just snippets on a wiki page.
Very cool. That's a good idea. I never thought of that.
There's a lot of scripts that I've had. It was like, how do you get your syntax to run? And it might be easier for you to understand. Having that demo is actually a great way to show, like I said, this is what it can do, and this is how you can do it. So when somebody says, this is where I want to be, giving them those directions, great way to get people to actually use your modules.
Yep. Yeah, you're trying to advertise to them how to use it in a way. So at least the most important things in the module. It's hard to cover every topic, but as long as you're driving the interest there, then you have a way for them to use it in the future. Cool. Were there any other questions that anybody had, or we can kind of dive into what this looks like behind the scenes, so we can kind of answer the question about what does this look like? What am I doing with Plaster behind? How do I make it work this way? And that will be another demo here. Okay, so I've already pre-written this advanced template, and that's that one that will create a whole lot of files, scaffold a large project for me. This is going to be the one that we're going to look at. And I'm going to go ahead and open this up inside of VS Code so we can get a good view of this. Right. So I've already structured this XML so that it's a lot easier to read. XML is really a kind of a weird language where you don't need any formatting. Try and make it make sense for you though. I wish there was a way to just have a really good XML prettier extension. I don't know one that I haven't found one that does exactly what I've done here. Thing is, you're not going to touch this template very often, so I've done some kind of manual customization around how I've structured it. It's up to you to however you want to organize this, but this is kind of an easy way to kind of reference it. The way this breaks down is there's just this short metadata section at the start. This is really just about finding the templates that you want. This is, really only for internal development. This is not something that gets put into the project. But as you scroll down, the things that will actually prompt the user are these sections where you're identifying and these parameters. So each one of these inside of Plaster has varying ways to ask the user for information. The ones that you'll end up using a lot are these text parameter types, and this is really just asking for the user for a bit of string, a bit of information that, in this case is just going to be the module name or the module description. This is just plain text, nothing special about it. I can use this however I want. I don't need to use that at all if I really just want to ask for 10 different parameters, but I don't know why you do that. You can get further along, and there's other types that are a little bit more key to specifically Plaster, things like this user full name. This is actually using a reference for your GitHub project, and if you're not identifying a specific default for it, I think it'll also look at the previous history of the Plaster run and pull that in if nothing's been identified there. You can also specify defaults for any of these as well. So if I wanted to have a default name, I could just specify a default property on my parameter, and that will have a default option when people come into it. The other types on here are choice. And so this is where you get to really think about what other options you want to present to the user as they're executing Plaster. I'm looking at things like, the PowerShell version that I want to run, and I'm asking people to specify if it's going to be 5.1 or 7.0. This is something that is going to prompt the user for an entry, and they need to answer it. Really, is the whole point of the choice entry. But you also have multiple choice. If you want, I can't choose. If I really wanted to say I'm supporting both 5 or 7, you can also make that an option and use that as a multiple choice option. In this case, I'm actually going through and selecting the options for all the different potential ways that I want the code to have a longer life cycle, have the code deployment process organized. That's all going to be included in this last section. But this is really just a demo. This is not really these features. What you want to do is really think about what you want to include inside of your project, all the important things for what you could ask the user as they're running through the Plaster process, and that's what you would include in any of these sections. These are just some of the options. I definitely recommend going to the Plaster documentation to get a more thorough, more in-depth understanding of what each of these do, but these are the basic options that I use all the time.
Dan, could you scroll up just a bit? Right. When you got a full name up there, the author of the module.
Yes.
It seems that every new person that comes in will be the author, or am I reading that wrong?
So this is only going to run the one time you run Plaster. So when you create the module and you execute Plaster, that will pick that user that ran Plaster at that time. So that'll be the author of the module itself.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. So this is all really just at this point gathering information for your module. This is not doing anything to create the module itself. It's not scaffolding any folders. This is really just collecting information from the end user so that you can now make an opinionated change to the environment. As we scroll down into this content section, this is where you're going to get into the bulk of the work. And really, this is taking a lot of the Plaster parameters that I created earlier on and utilizing them in different ways. So I like to use the module name. This could also just be a source, whatever you want to identify for where the code should run or should land. That's really just structuring based on however you want to organize the files. I like to use the module name inside of the project folder as well, so it's easier to understand where the code lives. But you could also use source. It just all depends on how you want to organize it. And this is all this is doing is, since these files don't exist anywhere internally, it's actually just creating new folders for me. This is very kind of the most basic way of just creating folders inside of your structure. So that's how I would get everything like my classes folder, my demo folder, or my documentation. These are all just blank files or blank folders that I'm creating at the time that Plaster executes. Now, the neat thing is you can also do things like taking files from my repository and actually also including that. So this is something that I've already created, saying this is all you ever need to include in here. Just take that from my project that already exists and throw it into every single module that I create in the future. That's one of the nice things that you have as an option with Plaster. So I do that with snippets as well as things like format files, at least to start. If you get more complicated, you can also do things like building templates files and taking contents from when you ask the user for questions and including those inside of the templated files. But the biggest templated file is going to be that manifest file. And there is this new module manifest command that will actually create the manifest file itself, that PSD1 file, and answer a lot of the core questions for the module manifest file. So I'm taking this directly from what I'm entering inside of the Plaster command as it runs, and I'm actually including that inside of my module manifest. So things like the description are directly being taken from the user. Things like the name of the module itself. If I wanted to include, ask the user for all of these, I can ask them as parameters. But I can also just make defaults that I'm going to say, this is always going to be UTF-8 encoded. So don't change that anytime in the future. Those are all things that you can include inside of that new module manifest parameter. And then, these are some of those conditions. When I mentioned earlier, I had the multiple choice options. You have this ability to take a file and set a condition for when it should be included. So I'm taking that options parameter that I created up here and this one right here. So I'm taking this options parameter and I'm saying anytime I see the choice for Plaster show up in here, then I'm going to execute, if it shows up as build, I'll include it as a condition for this particular parameter. And it's only going to include the file when build is selected. So any other time, it's not going to show up. It's all dependent upon how you want to build your module. So you don't necessarily need to include this for all your projects. It's all really depends on what the end user is going to respond to that. And so some of these are like what I mentioned earlier. There's the template files. All it's doing is taking an existing file and then including it with some very basic templating that you can do. You can kind of do just a very basic string replace inside of a new file. It's not a really robust system, but it's a system that at least gets you started. That's really the whole point of Plaster, is to just get you started. It's not going to write everything for you. It's getting you off and running in a way that is sensible and makes sense for anybody that's on your team that needs to be consistent with the way that they're writing their code. And that's kind of like the whole idea here. And again, this is all on my GitHub, so you don't necessarily need to look at every one of these and really fully understand them. The whole idea is to take what I have here, look and try and get an understanding of what it's doing, and go back and make the choices that make sense for your internal code pipelines, your internal code creation process, and build the Plaster templates that make sense for you. This is what I like to do for my projects, but it might not be the same for you. And if we go back to this demo, we'll go ahead and actually execute that advanced template that we just created. So again, I'm just creating a new random folder inside of my app data folder. I'm taking that template path that I collected earlier and just going to execute with invoke Plaster. And if you don't kind of cycle through that quickly, but if you haven't used splatting before, that's kind of where what I've just did in executing multiple parameters at once. And so now I'm stepping through with that customized layout that I wanted for my Plaster and module creation process. So I'm going to create a new module here. So for RTP SUG, and I will put. So again, this is stepping through exactly what I want the person to enter in. There's no way to deviate from. They have to enter in these items in here. Some of these have defaults. So if I just hit enter, it's going to default to 5 and execute with 5. In this case, I have a couple other options. I don't even want any of them, so I'm just going to hit N, and it will not include any of the other options on there. And as you can tell, it's going through a lot more in terms of what it created for my scaffolding. But those are all those additional folders that I created, just kind of blank directories, so you have a good sense of where you can, what you want to include inside of your project. And if we look at the breakdown of that folder, it now is following along on that original image that I showed you. It's got a bunch of different folders in here. It's got those two PSD1 and PSM1 files. It's got my snippets in here as well. And just kind of whatever else I wanted to include in here, I can include that. Some of these are going to be a little bit templatized, but not a ton. It really depends on how much information I want to include at that time. Go ahead and just open up that new project. what you'll see is I've got that whole folder structure in here now. You know, none of these have any items in here at the moment, but it's got a good sense of where you want people to contribute to create new functions in here. I have areas that I can create new private and public functions, and I have some very basic templating done so that I have a, you know, that short description that I created inside of my PSD1 as I generated it. It gave me, you know, my company name that I created. It included that description that I set on here. It included me as the author, since I've included that as at the time that I ran Plaster. Some of these are not options that you can change, unfortunately, because, like I said, Plaster hasn't been updated in a while, but those can be enhanced other ways if you write a script afterwards. It's kind of the way I've approached it in the past, and just have a script execute against your module after the fact. But this is at least a good place to start with your creation.
I raised
So-
my hand, but I have a question.
Go ahead, Stephen.
So back on your structure, this time, sorry to keep harping on this, the demo was now one level deeper than the screenshot. I'm curious as to why.
That's a great question. I think I was just not thinking about it a whole lot when I created this demo. It's all really dependent upon where you want to drop it. I just don't think I was paying attention when I created the template here.
That's cool. I don't need to point out the nitpicky stuff. I was just curious.
No reason, unfortunately. Cool. Were there any other questions about Plaster? Because we are kind of shifting topics a little bit and going to look at something a little bit different and talking about snippets as well.
I think we're good.
Cool. All right. So VSCode Snippets. I love snippets. Snippets are a great way for you to take some of the ideas that you want to provide to users, or when they actually get inside of a function and write the function in a way that's specific in particular for, you know, your standards that you're setting. Where Plaster builds that module for you, snippets are kind of getting to that next step and actually including specific templates for your functions. And the nice thing about this is, you know, they allow you to get as opinionated as you want. You can include dynamic responses, and again, they're portable. Allows you to move this wherever you want, and as long as it has an understanding of the language that a VS Code is using, whether the file is being identified as a PowerShell file, it'll execute a PowerShell snippet. But you can also use this for other languages. It's not exclusive to PowerShell, and that's why I think I like snippets so much. Is I use this in other places as well. I've used it throughout my Ansible writing for chocolatey packages. I've created specific snippets, or if you've ever used the Bicep extension from Microsoft, the entire thing is really based around the idea of writing snippets. And yeah, there's a lot of ways for you to interface with this. We'll talk about the most common ones, which I think are the inline options that you can execute at the time that you're writing your code, or things like keyboard shortcuts.
Still with us, Dan? See a lot of
Yeah,
screens.
sorry.
That's cool. I saw a lot of screen flashing. I thought maybe you having some issues.
Just trying to find the doc that I wanted to get into.
Yeah. It's going to look great in the final presentation.
Yeah.
Edits.
Perfect. Come back over to our project that we, I already have a project created and ready. The basic idea behind snippets is when I'm creating a new function, so if I have this existing project inside of my repo, this irrational logs repo, and I want to actually include a new function, let's say. I have the set log and write log functions. If I want to include a new function called just remove log, the main idea is I'm kind of stuck here now. I'm now at a blank screen. I have no idea what I want to write for my function. If I'm new to the team, I have to go to a standards doc and read through a whole doc on what I'm looking for to include for a function. What do I even declare? Kind of cumbersome because every project's going to be a little bit different. This is where snippets really comes into play and really makes it a lot easier. You can include this at the project level. So I have this snippets file at the project level, and it's going to read from that project level. And what you can do is using inline commands. I've built some initial kind of functions that will, or initial snippets that I can actually execute directly within this workspace. So I'll show you how you can also get to this in other places, but this allows me to at least get started writing some more advanced functions without having to really understand every single thing that I should be including inside my function, because I'm writing it as code and then handing it over to somebody else to then execute. I use this a lot just for myself because when I'm writing a new function, I don't want to even think about what I need to include. That's where snippets come into play. The nice thing is, it shows me a quick kind of breakdown here along the side of these functions to show me exactly what it would look like when I execute the function. Now, the cool thing is it doesn't also show me some of the variables that I've created in here. So as I run this, you'll also notice that it actually renamed the function itself based on the file name. That's where this gets to be really powerful, is you can start just really rapidly producing new functions. Now the cool thing here is it already puts me into the fields that I need to enter in. So I need to enter in a short description. And as I'm writing, and then updating information, if I tab to the next, or just hit tab, that'll tab me to the next section that I need to modify. So it's going to bring me down to the description field now. Now I can continue to write. And I'm never really moving away from just tabbing. I can just get anybody that's writing inside of this function step through process for what they need to include inside of their new function that they're creating. If I want to name, the parameter in a specific way, I could have included it as a template itself, but I can also just write it here at runtime, and it'll execute, and I can keep tabbing through, and it'll guide me through everything that I need to include as a standard for what I want people to write for, and a standard for my team to include in every single one of their functions. And there's this ability to also have multiple options. So what it's doing here is saying this can either be a PS object, a string, or an integer. I know this is a string for the log name itself, so I'm going to hit string. And the cool thing is now, once I've done that, it actually drops me right into the process block. And now I can start writing my new function without having to worry about filling all this information out from scratch. It's got me a good starting point. Now I can go ahead and start producing the code that I actually want to execute. If we actually look at, what does this actually look like? Because this is an awesome place to be, but how do I actually get to a place where I don't have to, create all of this? The main thing about snippets is this is all based in JSON files. And you can actually get to this in multiple locations. The one that we're going to start with here is inside of this VSCode folder at the root of your workspace. That's kind of one of the easiest ways of getting to it. What you're going to do is really just kind of identify core areas that you want people to write in. And so if we scroll down to that advanced function that I created, each one of these parts of the body is going to be what produces every single line inside of that function. So each one of these has a new line reference at the end, or a carriage return rather, at the end of the line, and then this new line reference will also include an additional end line. And then any of these other escape characters will include additional tab spacing. So you can really get opinionated on how you want the structure of the actual help to look as well. I can really drive a very strict way that saying I want every specific type of command line help option. You can include every one. I've included kind of the core ones that I think are the most important things, like the synopsis and description, parameter details. But you get as opinionated as you want for each of the functions that you're trying to create for your team. It's a great way to get a standard set across everybody's creation process. Now, when I was stepping through and tabbing through, that's where these number references come through. So you want to think of it as kind of an array that's built up of every place that it can step through, and each one of these is going to be in order the item that it's going to be filling in. So as I'm going through, the first space that it's going to enter in is that short description field, and then the second one's going to be the long description, the parameter name, and so on and so on. And then as I'm getting more detailed and really building an opinionated way for this, if I wanted to build additional options for people, that's where this kind of structure of having a double pipe comes in. Anything inside of these two pipes are the options that are going to be presented to the user. So that's why I had that field of PS object, string, or integer. That's kind of that opinionated block there. And then at the very end, this $0, that's where I'm going to drop in. That's where it's going to be the final landing zone for when I'm actually done with tabbing through. And that's where I want to put it inside that process block, get people to the point where they're now able and ready to start writing code. There's a lot of other additional options on here that are kind of hard to highlight. I would definitely recommend going back to the documentation for finding out things like the variable names that are specific environment variable names. I'm not going to go through all of them tonight. Definitely recommend going into the documentation, seeing what else you can do. This is just a good place to at least start getting people thinking about what to include for your functions. If you wanted to, make this a bit more robust, specific to the commandlets that you're trying to write, you can do that as well. And if I want to have, say, a credential parameter every time somebody executes the snippet, you can include that. It's all about how you want this to look. All right. And so, sorry, the other place that I talked about was inside of VS Code. There's also another section that you can kind of jump to that will work universally. It's just that it's not quite as easy to share those snippets across. If you go into the command section, I forget exactly what this is called, but if you hit Control Shift and P, it'll bring up the actual command prompt at the top of VS Code. If you just type in snippets, this will bring you to a place where you can configure your user snippets. And again, there's user snippets for every single possible supported language that VS Code has. If you actually search for just PowerShell, this will allow you to create PowerShell specific snippets that will be universal for every function that you'd want to write inside of PowerShell. And I say function, but you can actually execute a snippet at any time. So if you want to include something even more basic about just how you format a switch block, you can do that with a snippet. But this is going to be the place that you're going to want to go to, and this is specific to your user account, your user settings. So if you want to share this, it's a little bit more challenging because you need to think about how do I get this snippet, this information to everybody else. That's why I like to steer people more towards using this VS Code workspace folder and really just dropping your snippets there. That'll allow people that are opening the workspace a good place to just write specific snippets for their specific modules. Any other questions about snippets? Because I know it's kind of a lot to digest very quickly. I think it's one of those tools that you kind of need to work with a little bit before you really get a good grasp of it. I see the benefits of being able to take something brand new, give it to new people, and have a really quick understanding of how to use PowerShell and how to write a function that's set to a standard rather than going to a wiki page and saying, just read the docs. This is a good way to onboard them much more rapidly.
Hey, Stephen Judd, you want to ask that question?
No.
Oh. Okay. Now, see, I'm a little late to the joke.
The question was, can you cut and paste a snippet, or can you only copy them? Because I even screwed up my joke in the chat. Sorry.
Okay. Not sure. Yeah, don't know if that I understand, but
Snip and cut.
I gotcha. Okay. No.
We give him his time. He stay quiet. If he stays quieter, the more cooperative they will.
Jokes are better when I have to explain them.
Huh.
I've been told.
Cool. So that's kind of the basics for looking at things like Plaster and snippets inside of VS Code. You know, there's other ways that you can make this more customizable for you. Won't dive into it too much. I think a lot of this is going to be something that you need to really just test and design. Get a feel for what makes sense for your team. Take these tools, build a process that works for you. Really give this over to people on your team to make sure that they have an understanding of what you're trying to accomplish, because the core part of this is really getting everybody on the same page, getting a standard built that makes sense for everyone. I don't think I can really ignore, though, the idea that some of this will go away as we get into looking at things like autopilot and copilot. I don't have it set up for a demo tonight because I don't typically use it on my own personal VS Code, so I don't really have a good way to show it here. I think the thing that really is lacking about Copilot at the moment, unfortunately, is the way that you can provide this to people on your team. It's great for doing a lot of the things that I was showing you for snippets, because it takes it into account things that you've already written and produces something at least 90% similar. I think over time this is going to be a great way for you to build new processes. But I think the biggest detractor right now is that there's not a great way to make sure that 100% of the time it's going to be correct. Until then, I think really snippets or Plaster is going to be the way that you should really invest your time in understanding how they work, because it will help you write your code processes. And over time, maybe something like Copilot will get there, but unfortunately right now it's just there's too many unknowns for what it's trying to produce. Really recommend it to anybody. I would still recommend it to people to really get a good feel of it, because especially if you are a solo contributor, you're going to find great benefits from using Copilot, just because it can really think about things that maybe you're not even thinking about ahead of time. So yeah, that's kind of it for everything that I wanted to cover. I really appreciate the time, but if there's any other questions, I would be happy to answer them.
So, all right, so we're going to open it up to questions. We'll take a minute or two here to see if anybody has any follow-up stuff. Dan, I'll just say while waiting to see if anybody has any questions. This was an awesome talk tonight. I really enjoyed it. I picked up a bunch of things for myself. Thanks for spending the time with us. Anybody got any final questions for Dan before we wrap this up? All right. So we want to say thanks to Dan Hills tonight. He did a fantastic job.
My mic was
Dan,
muted.
oh, there we go. You have a question?
I don't have a question. I particularly probably won't ever be making modules at that capacity, I guess, per se. But I learned a couple really cool things during here, so that's cool. I appreciate you.
You know, Jacoby, it's kind of funny because when Dan started and I knew you were in the meeting, I was thinking, like, I wonder if Jacoby's going to chime in and say, if you do this, guess what this lets me do?
Believe me, I was in Discord. I'm talking to Steve in there. You gave me a Lobin. You announced a Lobin at the beginning of this. You gave me one. I put it on my list. I appreciate you. I use like Plaster and I use Visual Studio as proxies to run code for me. So I can use, this module as well. You can use it to pass commands into and then make it look like it's run from somewhere else. So I appreciate you. I added it to my Lobin library.
All right. So we're going to wrap it up here. Dan, fantastic job tonight. Lots of great information. If you're watching at home, we would like to. Oh, I did have a question for you, Dan. Do you know, happen to know off the top of your head how people can find out a little bit more about snippets? Is there maybe one of the guys can throw it in the chat as well? But that's probably one of those deeper things that people need to read up on a little bit.
Yeah, I'll send the link to the blog entry on Microsoft's blog, because that is the go-to. There's one really good blog entry that kind of dives into all the things like environment variables and how to actually target specific locations for your snippets. I think it's kind of an area that it's a lot that you can do with it. A lot of it is going to be stuff that you need to manage yourself, though, because there's not outside of things like the PowerShell extensions, there's not a lot of people producing snippet specific extensions. They're usually going to be coupled inside of another extension. Like I said, the things like the bicep extension, those have bicep specific snippets, or the PowerShell module or PowerShell extensions, those have their own set of snippets. But that blog on Microsoft.com, that's probably the best one to actually reference.
And I thought I saw it in an earlier slide, but did you mention where people can find your Git repo?
Yeah, that's just on github.com/Dan Dan-Hills.
Dan-Hills. Okay. Well, we thank you so much for spending the time with us tonight. I think everybody really enjoyed this. Good job tonight. I want to remind the people at home, if you're watching this on YouTube, the Research Triangle PowerShell User Group meets twice a month. We'd love to have you come in person and join us. The big benefit of coming in person is you get to ask the questions and you get to shape the conversation. If you watch this and you enjoyed it, take a look at the YouTube channel. We got about 135 other videos all related to PowerShell. And so we hope you take a look. I want to say once again, thanks to Dan Hills. Thank you, everyone, for coming tonight. We'll see you next time.